One of the most fascinating parts of Mormonism, and particularly Joseph Smith's early life, is this thing here, which is the seer stone. This is Joseph's brown, egg-shaped seer stone, which was used to produce the Book of Mormon. And at the same time that the Book of Mormon was being produced, this seer stone also was the means by which Joseph got revelations that were written down that then became what we now know as the Doctrine and Covenants, particularly those first 20 sections of this text. And up to about 2015, there wasn't a single picture of this, even though this seer stone has been in the church archives for centuries. And the thing to know about seer stones, particularly in Joseph's early life and the beginnings of the church, was this was everything. The plates were somewhere hid in the hill, away from other people, stopped from being, procured because it was treasure, and nobody saw it. But the seer stone, this thing here, I've got a replica right in front of me, this was seen every single day because this was used to create the Book of Mormon and those early revelations that formed the church. And to the people in Western New York who were from the same folk magic culture that Joseph was from, namely the Whitmers, they believed in the seer stone much more than anything else. If you read David Whitmer's statements later, he says basically Joseph fell into apostasy and as a fallen prophet when he stopped using the seer stones. But for the emerging church that went from Western New York through to Ohio, basically they had to jettison the idea of a seer stone because the people in Ohio did not believe in these folk magic instruments like Joseph and the Smiths and the other 50 to 100 converts who had come from Western New York. So the story about seer stones changed early, right about 1832-33, where the seer stone was replaced as this kind of important thing, and this biblical instrument, Urim and Thummim, was used to explain the translation of the Book of Mormon. This identified two white stones that were utilized as kind of spectacles to read the characters on the plates and produce the text of the Book of Mormon. This was a much better story, but it never actually happened. Martin Harris never saw the plates when he was the scribe for the first part of the Book of Mormon, the lost manuscript, and Oliver Cowdery never saw the plates as Joseph dictated the Book of Mormon in 1829. David Whitmer never saw the plates because Joseph never brought them to Fayette when the Book of Mormon was dictated in his home in June of 1829, and nobody saw the plates in connection with the Book of Mormon production. We even have Revelation in Doctrine and Covenants section 5 that nobody is to see the plates except for three witnesses that will see it afterwards. The only thing they ever saw was this stone or another stone like it, perhaps a white stone. And because Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer were all from the same Western New York folk magic tradition, they believed in seer stones and divining rods and visions, the kinds of things that were about esoteric understandings and connection with the unseen world. But when they got to Ohio, the people in Ohio didn't have that same background, and so things had to change in terms of the rhetoric, and those people kind of fell in line with that rhetoric because it was more popular, it took off more in terms of an understanding of what was going on, and that was slowly jettisoned from the historical record because it was unpalatable to connect the translation or the production of the Book of Mormon to some kind of spiritualist, occult, ceremonial magic rather than some power of God. So the seer stone is the only artifact we actually have with regard to the Book of Mormon. Everything else is produced from this, the original manuscript then the printer's manuscript, the character's document. There is no plates, no sword of Laban, no Urim and Thummim, no Liahona, and certainly no breastplates. Those things are imagined things in the esoteric world. The only physical object we have that is about the production of the Book of Mormon is this thing here, the seer stone, the brown egg-shaped seer stone that Joseph used in his hat to produce a text. And the most successful rebranding of Joseph's early folk magic is that this was barely talked about for 200 years. I'd like to return to the 8 witnesses just for a moment. I talked about this about 10 videos ago in number 882, talking about how this seems like a tack on to the original ideas of the Book of Mormon, that there would be 3 witnesses, and those 3 witnesses only would see the plates. And just want to look at that a bit closer and get your opinions. Isaac Hale, in his 1834 affidavit, says that Martin Harris, who had been Joseph Smith's scribe during 1828 and had basically produced a manuscript that got lost, came back to Harmony, Pennsylvania in March of 1829 to confront Joseph about being able to see the plates. Isaac Hale explained that the plates were hid in a box in the woods, and so actually the translation of the Book of Mormon came from Joseph's seer stone in a hat, which was just the same experience that Isaac Hale had seen him work as a money digger in 1825. Isaac Hale testified to the idea that Joseph got some kind of revelation from Jesus that he gave to Martin to kind of make him feel better about the fact that he hadn't seen these plates and that he wouldn't get to see these plates. And this became Doctrine and Covenants, section 5. Verse 3 says, I have caused that you should enter into a covenant with me, that you should not show them except to persons whom I should command you, and that you have a gift to translate the plates, but addition to your testimony, the testimony of 3 of my servants, and yea, they shall know of a surety from these things are true, for from heaven will I declare it unto them. But to none else will I grant this power to receive the same testimony among this generation. The testimony of 3 witnesses will I send forth on my word. So this revelation from God seems to direct the idea that there's going to be 3 witnesses and 3 witnesses only. Nobody is to see the plates because that's not what Joseph is commanded to do. This then becomes a really big deal in Fayette, New York. And we see in Ether chapter 5 the understanding that Moroni is getting and saying that the Book of Mormon will come forth unto 3 witnesses, and the truth of the Book of Mormon will be established by these 3 witnesses. So this is in line with Doctrine and Covenants section 5, which was given in March of 1829, and Ether is probably June of 1829. Soon after, we see 2 Nephi chapter 11 also talking about the idea that 3 people will get a view of the plates. But it does also say that more witnesses are possible. This is reiterated in 2 Nephi chapter 27, which says that the eyes of none shall behold it, save there be 3 witnesses. So this is again in line with Doctrine and Covenants section 5, and there is none other who shall view it, save it be a few according to the will of God. So there's some ambiguity in there. Now, I've gone back to the original manuscript, and of course, these passages are missing from the original manuscript, so we can't tell if these ideas of others were added in a little bit later, because it might be that the Book of Mormon was really specific about only 3, because that seems to align with Ether chapter 5 and also Doctrine and Covenants section 5. And this also seems to be in line with Doctrine and Covenants section 25, which is a revelation given to Emma. Now remember, Emma has been a scribe. She's been in the household pretty much the whole time of all of the dictation of the Book of Mormon, both with Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery, and possibly also into the Whitmer home. And yet she is not chosen as one of the witnesses, either the 3 witnesses or the 8 witnesses. And there is a passage that seems to to direct to this in Doctrine and Covenants section 25, which is, murmur not because of the things which thou hast not seen, for they are withheld from thee and from the world, which is wisdom in me in a time to come. Now, I guess you could argue that this is something else and not a view of the plates, but it seems to align with these understandings that she's being left out. And although modern Mormons and historians might suggest that Emma is a kind of a witness because she talks about it later in her life and suggests that she has at least handled the plates under a cloth, this seems to indicate that she's left out. I think because she's not from the same folk magic tradition that the Smiths and the Whitmers are, and that they can be coerced or enlightened into this esoteric understanding which they will sign their names to, and maybe Emma won't. But she's also a woman, and the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants don't seem to value women in the idea of being spiritually able or witnesses of the truth. But the fact that Doctrine and Covenants section 5 seems to indicate that God only wants 3 people to do it, and the Book of Mormon backs that up, the idea that there are 8 more witnesses to attest to the Book of Mormon seems out of place and probably a tack on, maybe due to a criticism that some people gave those initial spiritual witnesses, the 3, David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris, that wasn't quite enough and there needed to be a tangible witness. And so Joseph resurrects his plates, these prop maybe that he has stored in Manchester, which I believe he hasn't taken to Harmony, Pennsylvania. He's only taken a box. He certainly hasn't taken to Fayette, because we know he doesn't take anything there. And so he maybe utilizes his prop, but maybe he can show these 8 witnesses, and we've talked about the idea that he did it in 2 groups of 4, and that they were told, according to Doctrine and Covenants section 5, that they can't physically see the plates, but they could handle it under a cloth, and that they would have to attest to it in that way, and they could be part of this grand plan. Of course, they're heavily motivated to be involved because they're Whitmers and Smiths who are going to get a return on the Book of Mormon production, but also, it makes them feel special. And perhaps the witness statement for the 8 has overstated what they actually see, but they're willing to kind of go along with it because they are from the same folk magic tradition. And even if they can't physically see the plates, handling it under a cloth, maybe feeling the leaves of tin, maybe feeling some engravings on the plates, gives them a witness in their mind's eye that then they can attest to as if it's real. And of course, having these extra 8 witnesses are really important for the church and Joseph as it goes forward to suggest that this is a legitimate experience. And the church today has co-opted other people's feelings around this. Joseph Knight Sr., Catherine Smith, Mary Whitmer, and also Emma Smith, and some others that may have seen or handled or hefted that this is not just a few witnesses, but there's up to 17 or 19 people altogether have done this. But this is just out of sync with what Doctrine and Covenants section 5 says, which is really right at the beginning. And so it seems that Joseph has managed to procure other witnesses to attest to this, and that improves the legitimacy of the claim, but it undermines the revelation he got earlier. And so this is a really big deal that I don't think we really talk about very much. So give me your kind of take in the comments. Frank Colio says about my video about Joseph Smith's brown egg-shaped seer stone that this is misinformation, and that what I said about it being in the church archives for centuries is not true. So David Whitmer, in his 1887 address to all believers, says that Joseph gave Oliver Cowdery his brown egg-shaped seer stone in April of 1830, and that David Whitmer got that stone from Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery died in 1844. So, and of course, they were brother-in-laws. That Oliver Cowdery gave this stone to David Whitmer, and then it was held in the family archives and eventually went through to Utah and to the church. So the church has had it in its archives for at least 140 years, which is over a century. But the church also has dozens of seer stones in their collection because Joseph had multiple seer stones, and so did those first early converts, 50 to 100 of them, who came from that Western New York same folk magic tradition. Keith Erickson, in one of his firesides, talked about all of these stones that the church has in their archive that they just don't know quite what to do with because they don't have any labels on them to tell them whose stones they were. And the Community of Christ also has seer stones. They have in their archives, or had before they sold them, David Whitmer's seer stone, Hiram Page's seer stone, and others. Joseph had multiple seer stones through his life, and he continued to use them even into the Ohio church, even though he did this more privately. We know this from church records that he gave patriarchal blessings with his seer stone, and we know that some saw his seer stone, particularly Wilford Woodruff, later on as he produced the Book of Abraham. And some of Joseph's Doctrine and Covenants revelation teachings is that everybody is entitled to a seer stone, that the seer stone is like the earth will be when it becomes celestialized. While most modern members of the church have no connection to seer stones and what the heck they are or how they work or the kind of power ascribed to them, this was a major part of the early church. And lots of other people in the early church testified to this. If you go and look at Lucy Mack's biography, she talks about lots of people who had seer stones. Sally Chase had a green seer stone. There was a person in Ohio that had a black seer stone that was getting prophecies. And of course, in the Doctrine and Covenants, we see in Doctrine and Covenants section 28, Hiram Page getting revelation through his seer stone. Seer stones were basically poor man's crystal balls. They were the idea that you could find something special, you could ascribe power to it, that you could see this esoteric unseen world, and that this would be a major source of knowledge and power as people participated in gospel and religious understanding. So here's a few of the ideas of what Joseph Smith's other seer stones look like, just beside his brown one. These are in the church archives. We just don't have pictures like the ones that we have for the brown seer stone. But mark my words, they are there. They've been attested to by multiple people, including church historians who are working for the church. And of course, the Joseph Smith's Papers Project details some of these understandings about seer stone use in early Mormonism. In response to my video on Joseph's brown egg-shaped seer stone, Nah says he also used the Urim and Thummim, tell the truth. One of the things I said in my seer stone video was that people from Western New York in the same folk magic culture really privileged seer stones as a way of connecting with the unseen, esoteric, divine world. But when Joseph Smith migrated to Ohio with those early saints and joined Sidney Rignan's congregations, those Ohio people did not believe in seer stones like their New England refugee counterparts. And when new converts like Ezra Booth in 1831 and 1832 started to push back against Joseph and his revelations, also pushed back against this folk magic culture, and particularly seer stones. By January 1833, W. Phelps coined the term Urim and Thummim. These were biblical stones that were used for divination in the Old Testament, and now they were being compared to the Nephite interpreters that were held together by a bow as spectacles for the translation of the Book of Mormon. This term Urim and Thummim got really popular because instead of thinking about New England folk magic, people could talk about the Old Testament, and so Urim and Thummim became a really important term, and that was backdated into the historic record alongside the revelations that Joseph had already gotten, including some other references to put in Urim and Thummim and change the Book of Commandment revelations through to the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants sections. This change is still present today. So if you look at a Doctrine and Covenants, it will talk about Urim and Thummim repeatedly, and it will say that lots of those early revelations were got from Urim and Thummim. And this is simply not true. These were all got by a seer stone. While there were this idea of spectacles alongside the plates when Joseph retrieved them, and these spectacles were made up of two seer stones that he could then look through, this was not something that any of the witnesses to the translation in the contemporary world talked about. They only ever talked about Joseph using his seer stone, his personal one, in a hat. The idea of Urim and Thummim is actually anachronistic to the historical record, particularly the accounts of the most earliest understandings of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And it gets worse than that, because when you look at the most earliest understandings of the plates, you understand that Joseph used his seer stone to get this vision of an angel, this idea and location of the plates. And then inside the collection of the plates was the idea that he received a new seer stone as part of that, an even more powerful seer stone than the one he had. Joseph Knight Sr. relates the idea that when he first was told about this retrieval of the plates, Joseph was more concerned and impressed by the stones that were recovered at the same time. And there are some ongoing accounts that Joseph found two stones as part of his retrieval of the plates, and these are mentioned actually in the Book of Mormon as the stones that the brother of Jared touched to be able to get light. The idea that they might look a little bit like this, translucent white stones that gave some kind of understanding and lightning, and that by looking into them they would appear to change and show things just like a crystal ball. So later accounts trying to get away from the seer stone and a hat use talked a lot about the idea that this Urim and Thummim were held in these spectacles. These spectacles were attached to a breastplate, and Joseph looked through these stones in order to see the characters on the plates and translate to English. This is simply not attested to by any of the witnesses or any of the scribes who were involved in the production of the Book of Mormon. They only ever saw Joseph with his head buried in a hat and a seer stone. The plates were never in the room. Joseph never consulted them. He absolutely used his seer stone to remote view them, because that's what people believed about seer stones. But subsequent converts who didn't come from that same tradition, and also those who were outside who were mocking Joseph because of his seer stone use, meant that the story changed significantly, and that became the dominant narrative to explain the translation of the Book of Mormon. So the term Urim and Thummim is anachronistic, and it's also a misdirection. You cannot rely on it, and anywhere that it says Urim and Thummim in the current Doctrine and Covenants, you should really replace with seer stone. The Urim and Thummim as a replacement for the seer stone is not the only major treasure-digging story change that the church adopted and reinvented, backdated into the historic record, and made much more of it than was the beginning of the story. Many of you will be familiar with this picture, which is the angel Moroni visiting Joseph one night in 1823 and telling him about the plates that were buried in the nearby hill Cumorah. You might be surprised to learn that the name Moroni, or the idea that he's an angel, is something that happens much later in the historic record, and that is backdated way back to 1823. Joseph was a treasure digger, and part of that law was that the kinds of riches that were held under the ground were set there and protected by guardians. The idea that somebody who may have been slaughtered at the time, thrown into the hole with the chest of money, is now the responsible spirit who will guard this treasure for its owner against infiltrators or stealers. These victims were now demons who protected the loot. And they were tricksy. they would move the treasure if you got too close to it. And so you would have to do certain rituals to trap the spirit, to separate it from the treasure and enable you to dig so that you could retrieve the loot before the treasure spirit and guardian had a chance to whisk it away. And this was the mechanism to explain too why you would never be able to retrieve any treasure, because the guardian was just too powerful, or somebody had done something wrong in the ritual, and therefore power had been taken away, and this treasure, this loot, this riches that was supposed to be yours is now being transported under the ground to a new location. A seer stone, like Joseph's brown egg-shaped seer stone, was the mechanism by which you could see the guardian around the treasure, that you could almost commune with the guardian in order to figure out a way to get the treasure, and by which you might be able to outsmart the guardian so you can get the treasure. So some of the earliest understandings about Joseph and this treasure was that he looked in his stone and saw it, and saw this guardian who then he was able to connect with and have a conversation with. And as he personally tried to retrieve this treasure, he communed with the guardian, and the guardian fought back violently, knocking him to the ground, giving him tasks, trying to trick him and lead him astray. And Joseph was trying desperately to do exactly what was needed to defeat the guardian, to obey his commands, but also figure out a way to circumvent the guardian so that he could procure what it was that he was after. So the earliest accounts by people like Oliver Cowdery and Lucy Mack Smith talk about how Joseph was denied this treasure, denied violently, and handled by the guardian as he tried to figure out a way to get around the guardian's requests and exactly do it, but also be able to bring home something. And this is why it took years, going to the anniversary on the 21st and 22nd of September each year, to try and commune with the guardian and get the treasure. And of course he lost this many, many times until 1827. But later, as these riches morphed into a religious text, the idea of a bleeding ghost who is a demon spirit guarding the treasure morphed into the idea that this is a benevolent angel, a resurrected being from the past who has come to give Joseph the ability to translate the records of these ancient inhabitants of America. And eventually this angel got a name, and that name was Moroni, who was the last person to bury this treasure. But for a significant period of time, this acquisition was a quest that was fought by Joseph over and over and over again till he prevailed against the guardian, who sought to trick him, but also sought to harm him as he tried to extract this richness and loot. Big L asks a really great question in relation to the Urim and Thummim. Haven't a few LDS historians argued that Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim on the lost 116 pages and then used the seer stone for the Book of Mormon the LDS Church uses now? Yes, they absolutely have, and the best example that you can find of this is in the Gospel Topics essay on the translation of the Book of Mormon, where whoever the unknown historians are commenting on this basically says that he used the Urim and Thummim first, and then for convenience used the brown seer stone in the hat. Now this all really comes down to some reconciliation that Emma Smith herself does when she gives an interview in 1870 on the translation of the Book of Mormon, because she also says that Joseph uses his brown egg-shaped stone in a hat to bring forth the Book of Mormon. But she has to reconcile that with some of the accounts in Joseph Smith's history, particularly his 1838 history, and we'll talk about that in a second. But here is the quote. Now, the first that my husband translated the book was translated by the use of the Urim and Thummim, and that was the part that Martin Harris lost. After that, he used a small stone, not exactly black, but rather dark in colour. In the 1838 Joseph Smith history, Joseph relates this around about the stones, right? He says, also there were 2 stones in silver bows, and these stones fastened to the breastplate constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim. He goes on to say that I should not show them to any person, neither the breastplate with the Urim and Thummim, only to show to whom I should be commanded to show them. If I did, I should be destroyed. Now, you've probably already picked up a couple of problems. One is that Urim and Thummim is a term that's been used both in the Joseph Smith history of 1838 and in Emma Smith's account in 1870, and this term does not exist when these events actually happen in 1829. And what's more problematic is the term Urim and Thummim is used both for seer stones and for the Nephite interpreters, which is the instrument that Joseph said that he recovered with the plates. In Lucy Mack's history, which is later also, it's 1845, she talks incessantly about the Urim and Thummim, but she's obviously talking about sometimes Joseph's seer stone and sometimes this idea of spectacles that contain these 2 stones that she got to handle in a cloth, and so she feels like this is an important part of the what Joseph got from the hill when he retrieved the plates. The problem with all that is nobody who is around the translation process attests to this. Isaac Hale says he uses a stone in a hat. Oliver Cowdery doesn't mention it. David Whitmer doesn't mention it. They're all seeing Joseph use a stone in a hat. Only Martin Harris and Emma Smith attests to the idea of things in 1828 with the lost manuscript, but even then Martin goes on and talks about the whole idea that he replaced a stone from the riverbank while he's skipping stones and put it into the hat, and Joseph said that everything went dark, and so that was a testimony to Martin Harris that really Joseph was getting an understanding from the seer stone, but obviously this is just a trick. Martin Harris never attests to the idea that there's anything like spectacles, that they're attached to a breastplate, that these are the mechanism by which Joseph looks at the plates. Because, of course, Martin Harris never sees the plates, and he goes back in March to confront Joseph about this and gets Doctrine and Covenants section 5, which says that nobody is to see the plates, because Martin has not seen the plates during the time of 1828, neither has Isaac Hale, neither has Emma Smith. This just is not a non-event. But people later on are trying to put all of these pieces together and trying to privilege Joseph particularly and say that what he's talking about is true, while also having to front up to the idea that there is a seer stone in a hat that is producing the Book of Mormon. And this ambiguity is what particularly historians from the church are trying to play on, because they don't want to tell you that the seer stone is the only thing we really have any solid evidence for. They want to suggest that there was some point in time, and Emma gives that case, that the Urim and Thummim, or these Nephite interpreters wrapped up in these spectacles, were being used. But there is no contemporary evidence to suggest this. It's only later accounts trying to reconcile these different stories that, even give some credence to the idea that this could be the case. There are some really early contemporary accounts around the idea of spectacles, though, particularly from Samuel Lawrence, who went up to the hill with Joseph and suggested that these plates that he could see in his own seer stone were related to giants in the past, and that's why the breastplate was said to be particularly big, and even the spectacles too big for a normal human. And some other people have reconciled those accounts with the idea that Joseph took the stones out of the spectacles to put them in his hat, because he couldn't actually look through both spectacles, both spectacle eyelets at the same time, because they were meant for a giant, and Joseph wasn't a giant. And of course, we don't have these spectacles, this artifact, to which Lucy Mack Smith attests to being handling at the time that Joseph got them from the hill. They don't go anywhere, and we don't know where they went, and so people do kind of assume or suggest that the angel took them away, and of course we don't have them, and we just don't have any contemporary understanding of Joseph using them like they are being told. But everybody's trying to reconcile these slightly conflicting stories to try and make sense and offer their testimony of the Book of Mormon. One of the craziest things about Mormonism is that the story has been sanitized and whitewashed over time by the church to make it seem more palatable to a Christian audience particularly. But if you go back to the original stories, they are fascinating and just incredible and adventurous and, dark. So I want to highlight this author, Mark Elwood, who does these graphic novels. This is one that I have, The Glass Looker. This is his first one. And this is his second one. And these are all tales of Joseph Smith and his early treasure digs and the ideas of how the Book of Mormon came forth, but also the kinds of inner Dungeons and Dragons, adventure that Joseph was having in the hills around his home. They're full of stories of other glass lookers or seerstone users, like Sally Chase in this particular story, or even the idea of this guardian that tells Joseph about the plates in the hill Cumorah, and the idea that it's more like a savage demon who comes and talks with Joseph. Mark Elwood's historical work on the boy Joseph and how as a youth he participated in treasure digs is one of the great historical understandings of its time, and he really brings it to life with these graphic novels. He's currently producing his third novel, and this should be out later this year. But go get another version of Joseph and this inner world as a young man. This is fascinating, it's really enjoyable, and it's just beautifully, artistically well done.